When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we have a special one joined by JC once again. Now, unfortunately, the intro to this video had some technical difficulties, so I'm just going to kind of give you guys a little run through, and then we'll hop on into the rankings. But this ranking largely is us ranking the main A Song of Ice and Fire books outside of, we did not do the World of Westeros book. We just did A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, Fire and Blood, and the main series books. We're ranking them based off of, well, what we think the best are. That accounts for pacing, the writing, maybe even some of our own favoritism, some of the themes of the books, all those type of things. You'll hear us kind of discuss those throughout the video. Unfortunately, me and JC's first ranking did get cut off because of some technical difficulties, so I wanted to explain both of our number 7 choices, and you'll hear some of the tail end kind of reasoning as well on my selection anyway, but JC's got cut off. So, starting out the video, JC's number 7 was Fire and Blood. I don't think this is a surprise for most people. Fire and Blood is a book that you either really like it or you're kind of on it. And I'm one of those people that really likes it, and I'll talk about that throughout the video. But JC, I think, has the common opinion of a lot of people. It's hard to match it up against the other books because it is a history book. It's not a narrative piece. We're not in characters' heads. We're not like in the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms tales where we learn a ton about Duncan Egg or any of those characters. Or we're not like in the main Song of Ice and Fire series where we're learning about all these different characters and the political, movements directly from the characters. It's a lot of, behind the scenes. And I think Fire and Blood at times has some pacing issues, and that's what JC really talked about a lot. So I hope I gave the explanation that I remember him giving to the best of my ability, but that was his number 7. My number 7, on the other hand, was A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. I can already hear the uproar in the comments section. I think A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is just tough to me because it is a shorter book. It's a book that I really do enjoy. I think it's some of George's best written material, but it's hard to compare it to books like Fire and Blood, the main series, because it is 3 times smaller than those books are. And because of how high quality this series is, I just don't feel right putting something that is great for what we do get of it. But this is a book that each one of the novellas you can read in like an afternoon. So, I don't know. To me personally, I felt that the quantity holds down the novellas, but I think as we get more of them, if we do from George, these will only get higher and higher and higher. But for me personally, I think almost purely the quantity of the book holds it down versus other things in this series that I really appreciate more, like other books that sustain greatness throughout the entire run, and it's 3 times longer than this book. To me, that really factors into how I rank things. So now let's finally jump back in, and I want to say thank you, JC, for sticking with me on all the technical difficulties of this recording. It was definitely a tough one, and let's jump into the actual discussion between me and JC.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I mean, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is what? Slightly more than 300 pages. It doesn't quite necessarily have the time investment that the main A Song of Ice and Fire series has. Yes, it's a very character centered piece. And although I disagree with you, Grease, on the placement of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms being in last place, I can see why maybe it's not quite as immersive as some of the larger, more dramatic books in the main series. So, no shame.
Yeah, I think it's just, yeah, like I said, it's purely just on that it's almost not like immersion because I feel like A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, you do get quite immersed in it. I just feel like you're not in it that long is almost, and it's also a very incomplete story, so that's another part of it. I mean, to me, I think A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, if we do get more novellas and this, series starts to really expand out more and this becomes more of a full story of or whatnot, I think it'll probably rise at least a couple spots. But for me, I can't really justify putting it over like a book like Fire and Blood that I really enjoy for, Maester conspiracy stuff, a lot of the characters that are in there that I
Yeah.
enjoy trying to craft who they are and things like that. But yeah. So getting to number 6, JC, what is your number 6 ranked book?
So this might I mean, I think Greece, you will probably agree with me, but this might make a couple people cry in the comment section. But my sixth place book is A Dance with Dragons from the main A Song of Ice and Fire series. And the reason for that is because although A Dance with Dragons and A Storm of Swords are about equal in length in terms of page time, A Storm of Swords feels like there's something going on in every page, especially that last half of that book. It feels like you can't remove a singular chapter. Every single word that George R. R. Martin writes in that book is necessary for the overall understanding of the story. Whereas The Dance of Dragons, I recently went through it for a summary video that I've worked on, and oh boy, oh my gosh, there's so much, and again, the story is still good. I am immersed, and the lore within A Dance of Dragons is some of the deepest in the series. So much about the Blackfires and Grand Maester conspiracy and the Grand Northern conspiracy. Just so many conspiracies and opportunities for lore expansion are definitely there. But there's also a bunch of talk about sellsword companies and Volantine politics and Penny and Quentin and all this information that I think George R. R. Martin could have removed from the Dance of Dragons book, and it would have made for a more concise story that not only would have made for a more it's still an engaging book, but would have made for a quicker paced story. But in addition to that, he could have also made room for the two battles that got cut from this book and postponed to the Winds of Winter, because without those two battles, it feels like a Dance of Dragons, just as it's about to hit third, fourth gear, it cuts off right there, right at the end. It's like, wait, where's Stannis versus the Freys? Where's Marine versus Yunkai? Where the heck are my battles, man? Where's my conclusion to this story? So pacing, the length of the book, and also the character split a little bit, but it's mainly the lack of ending that I think makes this my least favorite book.
Yeah, I am. Boy, I struggle with the placement of Dance with Dragons. I will say it's not my number six, but I very much contemplated it being my number six because
Mm,
to me, every time I reread it, I enjoy that book less and less. And so I'll save a lot of my thoughts for when I actually place it. But I agree with a lot of your sentiment there. And I think I know why people like the book. But boy, there are some things that really I just do not enjoy about that book, even though I still really like it. But talking on my number six is Fire and Blood. I teetered on putting Fire and Blood a little higher, but I
mm.
just couldn't justify it because I think A Dance with Dragons has some of George's strongest writing in terms of characters, like Theon. I think John is really fantastic in that book. So the things I love about Fire and Blood, I really love the Maester conspiracy side of it. I've really enjoyed
Oh
this
yeah,
book as I've been going back and, rereading it, doing my Maester conspiracy notes, all the things that I think are sus or questionable that we should question. I have a whole like Google Doc of notes, and I've really enjoyed that aspect of it. I really enjoy trying to put together who some of the characters of this story really are. Characters specifically like it's a lot of the fiery characters. I do like a lot of the characters that, are like Rhaena Targaryen, the Queen of the West, or Maegor, and maybe Aenys and those characters, and
yeah,
Rhaenyra and the dance. But I have to, note there are some weaknesses of this book. I think, like you talked about when you ranked Fire and Blood, it not being like a coherent, like narrative story, I think hurts it. I think that Jaehaerys's reign really slows the pacing down of this book quite a lot, because you come off of I think Aegon's reign to the end of Maegor's reign, even in the early stages of Jaehaerys's reign, is all fantastic to read for me. And then you hit Jaehaerys's reign where there's just not a ton happening really. It's just the building up of the kingdoms and Jaehaerys and his children, how that stuff goes down, all kind of very slowly building back up to the dance. And then this book also, Aegon the Third stuff at the end is kind of, but
yeah.
I still love this book. I have a personal bias for this book. I love this book, but I do think it's at it's got to be in your bottom three for me. I don't think it touches any of the main The Song of Ice and Fire books outside of Dance. I think
Yeah.
there's an argument, but yeah,
Yeah. No, and I mean to kind of pair it off of you, I agree. I mean, for what it is, for what George R. R. Martin was trying to do, which was essentially write a history textbook about the Targaryens, I think it does that very well. Um, with the exception of maybe some of Jaehaerys' stuff and some of the stuff at the end. It's a very eventful, dramatic history book that I would say is even a little bit more interesting than our real world history
yeah,
here in the real world.
yeah, agreed.
Um, but yeah, it is the fact that this is not it's just not a narrative, it's a history textbook, and I think because of that, although it's very interesting and there's a lot of lore in Fire and Blood for sure, when compared to the main series that's more concerned with actual characters that we follow and their personalities and a story that has a beginning, middle, and end. I think that has probably more narrative. Well, that has more narrative weight than this Fire and Blood history book.
Agreed. So that'll get us to our number 5, JC. Lead us into what is your number 5 A Song of Ice and Fire book?
Well, my number 5 is your number 7, Greece, because I have A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the novella compilation following Duncan Egg. I recently went through the Hedge Knight. I haven't gone through. So I've read all three novellas before. I've reread the Hedge Knight recently. I need to reread the other two books, but wow, there's a lot here that is just dripping with personality. It's a very immersive story, and I think what makes this kind of pushes this over the top for me when compared to A Dance with Dragons is that it's a very, very concise narrative. We follow two characters. We really get to know those two characters, and it's just it tells you only the information you need to know about these two characters and the adventures they go on. It's immersive. There's some Blackfire lore, amazing stuff there close to the end of this novella compilation. It's immersive. I love these characters, and I think it's an all in all some of George's some best work. It's a great read.
I agree 100%. I talked about this when I ranked it. I agree with everything you said there. Like, it just feels like everything in in the novellas in general is needed. It all is telling a story that is telling complex themes and great character building. So yeah, I agree with a lot of the reasons you put it this high. And again, I'm not surprised at all. But we do have like the same bottom three, just in different
Yeah,
areas, which is why I said like I feel like the bottom three to me you can almost place in any range, and I think it makes a lot of sense because there's things that may push a book forward for you. But for my number 5, I do have A Dance with Dragons. I will say as time goes on, this book to me just slowly I have a worse and worse opinion of it. And that isn't to say I don't like this book or I don't love this book. I still do for the things that it does well and for this world that it's in, but there's some stretches of this book. And again, I'm, doing a reread every single week where I talk about in-depth chapters with the Game of Thrones and Clash of Kings. I've did a Feast for Crows retrospective, a Dance with Dragons retrospective. A Dance with Dragons is the only book that I've like had to take a break. I was just like I could
yeah,
not, I was doing that retrospective and I was just hitting Tyrion, Quentin, all these chapters back to back to back, and it's just those plot lines to me take what could have been a fantastic book. I think A Dance with Dragons could have been the best book of the series if done a little better in terms of just the pacing, like you talked about, JC, earlier. And you have certain plot lines that are building to something that are fantastic. Theon and Asha, in my opinion, are just
oh
fantastic
yeah,
POVs in this book. I think John is, if not at his best, I'd probably say he's probably at his second best book. Storm of Swords, he's probably a bit better, but his plotline I thoroughly enjoy for the most part. I think there's chapters here and there that, they kind of run together a little bit with like the wildling plot post Stannis.
yeah,
But I just think that it has such low points. I think it has the lowest points of the entire series of any of George's writing, regardless. And that just holds it down for me. It makes it just not as enjoyable as it could be at certain points. Like you talked about, the ending feels very strange to be an ending. We don't get really the conclusion of Stannis' arc whatsoever.
right,
Theon kind of gets the ending of his, but then Asha doesn't feel like she gets the conclusion to what that arc's been building towards. The stuff at Marine kind of ends on a weird note as well. We're like basically on the cusp of another battle, and then we just cut off. It feels like if in book 2 we got to the Battle of the Blackwater and then it just stopped. It just
yeah.
feels really, really weird to me. But yeah. So that is why my number 5 is the Dance with Dragons.
I think we covered our bases here for Dance with Dragons, and if people want to hear more of our opinions, you and I also
Yeah,
have our respective videos covering A Dance with Dragons, where they could hear more detail about what makes us both like that book and what makes us also maybe not like that book as much as the other books.
agreed. And I do want to just say, because I know there's going to be people that love a Dance with Dragons out there, this is still like a top 10 to 15 book
Oh
for
yeah,
me. But
yeah,
it's just when you're putting it up to, I think, some of the best writing we have out there in fantasy, somebody's got to be towards the end. So that's just
yeah.
how we feel.
Yeah. again, like as you mentioned earlier, like there's definitely, each one of these books has peaks.
Yep,
There's definitely peaks here, and I would say the peaks here in this book are higher than A Feast for Crows, which
of
I'm sure
course.
we're going to talk about at some point here. However, the lows are much lower than A Feast for Crows, and probably much lower than I think virtually every other book within the main series. It's just got some pretty bad lows that I think overall drag the average down to be less than the other four.
Agreed. It's just not a consistent book. I think that that's
Yeah,
just the whole argument, and we'll talk about A Feast for Crows, but it's kind of the opposite, which is what I find so funny. Is Feast for Crows and Dance Dragons are almost polar opposite books,
yeah.
but yeah. So JC, let's get into your number 4.
Well, speaking of A Feast for Crows, I've got A Feast for Crows as my number 4 book. Perfect segue there. Um, yeah, originally I had this book much higher, but I think on a third read through, I've since come to have a greater appreciation for the first 3 books just because those 3 books actually have a beginning, middle, and end. Whereas A Feast for Crows and A Dance of Dragons, we've got a beginning and middle, but we don't necessarily have an end to some of those arcs. So I think deep within my heart, even though I do like this book better on each consecutive read through, I just can't put it over the first 3 books. So I've got this one at number 4. I think it's some of George R. R. Martin's best writing. Again, similar to A Dance of Dragons, we've got a lot of wonderful lore here. The Grand Maester conspiracy, everything involving Jaime Lannister's character development. Grease, I know Cersei's not exactly one of your favorite characters, but I absolutely love and devour every single one of Cersei's psychotic chapters. She's so just hilariously funny and witty and just so messed up. I love it. Dripping with so much personality. It's my jam. With that said, when I first read A Feast for Crows, I was bummed that we were only getting half the characters from A Storm of Swords, and we had to unfortunately wait until, well, you and I didn't have to wait, but I'm sure readers back in 2005 were frustrated that they had to wait to A Dance of Dragons to read the second half, the second portion of those characters. And in addition to that, although I do enjoy A Feast for Crows from a very personality, character driven lore perspective, it doesn't quite have. Not that I'm, some dumb poo poo reader who needs action 24/7 in my books, but a little bit every now and then is nice.
It is
And
nice.
it is nice, and the fact that we're missing the fact that this book, I think, with the exception of one scene where Victarion is fighting, a couple people on the Shield Islands, and a interaction between Brienne of Tarth and Biter before she gets dragged away to Lady Stoneheart's Brotherhood Without Banners camp. There's not really much in terms of action here, so it makes for a little bit of a slower read, which I've appreciated more on each consecutive read through, but I think because of that, just makes it a little bit just slower and maybe not quite as impactful as the first 3 books. So, still an enjoyable book. I love A Feast for Crows. Great prose, great character, great personality. Just not quite as much as the first 3 books.
We're on the same page. I also had A Feast for Crows at 4, which was
Mm,
kind of why I was, hinting at it a little bit. But
cool.
A Feast for Crows to me is a polar opposite to Dance with Dragons. A Feast for Crows is a book that I don't necessarily think has too many lows. I think it does have some with Samwell's plotline and a little bit of Brienne's
Yeah.
early, like her early couple
Yeah.
chapters where it takes a little bit to get going for her. But I think it's a very consistent book. It really just has this, okay, almost every chapter is in a good area. There's not a lot that I would go to or like, oh, this is the best of the series, but there's not a lot that I would go, these are the worst of the series. There's just a lot of good. It's a very consistent book in my opinion. And as I've reread the series, I've probably read that book, I don't know, a good amount of times now at this point. I've enjoyed it each and every time because really that book is a lot of about, more character study than it is about, the action or these big, huge plot twists or whatever, because it's coming after A Storm of Swords, which was just a purely a payoff book. So Feast for Crows had a lot of heavy lifting. How do you now move towards the next phase of the story? And I think for a lot of, first time readers, myself, included, it didn't necessarily give readers what they wanted, right? Coming off of Tyrion, he's just killed his father. He's going, into exile, all this stuff, and we don't see him. Jon has
Yeah.
become, Lord Commander. Stannis is at the wall. We don't see him. It's a lot of that I think hampers this book for, I think, more of a casual audience that's only read the series maybe once or twice. And so I enjoy Feast for Crows for what it is. There's some really high moments. I think this is a theme heavy book, especially with Brienne's plot line. And so I enjoy a lot of those things. I just think that in terms of the first three books, I think the first three books all hit bigger heights than A Feast for Crows does. And so I think that's the only real reason I have it lower. And I also enjoy that the first three books, like you mentioned, feel more cohesive. They feel like a story that's all building to something. Something that happens in book one, maybe some little thing that you're thinking about has a major payoff either in book two or book three. The same with book two as well. And so those all feel really well put together. It's why I always say I think for me the first three are my favorite three, and A Feast for Crows. It has continued to climb through my ranks, but I think this is probably where it'll stay for the foreseeable future until wins. But
Yeah.
yeah. Any other closing thoughts on Feast for Crows, JC, before we move to three?
Yeah, I mean, as we mentioned before, there's a lot here within the first book that maybe we didn't quite appreciate, or a lot here within this book that we didn't appreciate on the first read through that I think we appreciate more. So, if someone out there read it has only read A Feast for Crows once and they're like, "Ah, man, I don't know, I don't know if I want to go through this book again," I recommend that you go through rereading it again. This time, kind of with the more lens of like, all right, let me look at the characters, and I think there's more to appreciate, especially from the Dornish side and even some from the Iron Islands side. But Doran Martell, his all the stuff that's going on there, I loved a lot on a second and third read through.
I agree. Going with an open mind. Um,
Yeah.
I specifically like my favorite two chapters of the entire book were a Dornish chapter and an Ironborn chapter. The Kingsmoot
Mm.
chapter and Ariane's failed coup. Those are basically my favorite two chapters of the book. Those are not the main POVs of that story. And I think another thing, just because I thought about it before we go into number four or number three, I will say, I think Feast for Crows, if it had been given its conclusions that A Dance with Dragons gets, maybe we'd be having a different conversation. Because the fact that in my opinion, Arya's best chapters of her Bravos arc are in Dance with Dragons is a crime. And then Cersei's conclusion also being on A Dance with Dragons is also a crime to Feast for Crows.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's another one of those ideas as well. But let's move on to number three, JC. What do you have as your number three book?
Well, at the risk of we becoming enemies from this point forward, I've got A Clash of Kings as my number
Let me
three.
interrupt you right there. That is acceptable. I think that the first
Okay.
three are the top three in any order. But people that have Clash of Kings as their least favorite book, are you out of your mind? I am looking at you,
Yeah.
viewer, right now, and typing in the comments. I'm looking at you. How is Clash of Kings your least favorite book? Tell me in the comments. All right, continue, JC.
We riot,
That's
riot.
right.
Um, No, there's again, we've talked about this previously. The fact that we have a beginning, middle, and end for a lot of the arcs here within the first three books, I think just make the first three books the best three books in this series. And that includes A Clash of Kings. I think when compared to the first book and the third book, I think it is a case of maybe middle book syndrome where, you've already gotten through the high of, oh, whoa, Ned Stark just got executed in the first book, but you haven't quite reached the climactic highs of the third book. So you kind of have that connective tissue that connects both books one and three. So maybe it's not quite as memorable as books one and three, in my opinion, but there's still a lot there that is intriguing within this connective tissue. We've got the War of the Five Kings, Stannis Baratheon, Renly Baratheon, all the stuff that's going on north of the Wall with Jon Snow and him venturing forth with Jorah Mormont as they're currently searching for Benjen Stark, and then obviously the super amazing climactic conclusion with the Battle of Blackwater Bay, which I think of the entire series is probably my favorite stretch of consecutive chapters in this series. With that said, I think it's just the fact that again we've got some middle book syndrome here, and I would say that you could probably cut out maybe two Daenerys chapters here and there from this book that I think maybe make this a slightly lesser book than the first and third book. But as far as everything else goes, I think you've got a great character driven book with a fantastic climax.
I agree. I'll talk about Clash of Kings when I get to it for me. I
Okay.
think the one thing I'll say about A Clash of Kings, which I think makes it go down for a lot of people, is it has a similar structure to A Dance with Dragons in terms of I think it has some lower lows, like you referenced with
Mm,
Daenerys, but I also think it has extreme highs as well. So to me, but personally, I think Dance with Dragons is basically a Clash of Kings on crack. Like it just has even further gaps. But we'll talk
Yeah.
about that later on. I understand why people don't have it as their favorite and all that stuff, but it cannot be last. That's all I'll say. It cannot be last of the main five. It cannot be last. But yeah, I'll talk about my number three. So my number three is a Game of Thrones, and I really do love a Game of Thrones. It is the starting book. It starts it all. I think in terms of consistency, I also have this as my best written book of the series. In terms of consistency from chapter to chapter, I think there really are not bad chapters in this book. Like the lowest chapter that I have for a Game of Thrones in my reread was Bran 3, and it's the one where he
Hmm.
gets awakened. It's a really short chapter, but it's like the where he's in a dream sequence and he awakens or whatnot. Even that chapter I think is better than a number of chapters from like a lot of the other books, especially Dance with Dragons. And so I think that a Game of Thrones to me, it doesn't necessarily hit the highs or some of the best writing stuff that I enjoy from the next two books, from book 2 and book 3, but I appreciate it for what it is because it is such a different book than the rest of the series. It's very condensed. We really only have a couple different plot lines going on with, Daenerys, and we have the King's Landing plot, and then you kind of have the North plot for the most part, and then you kind of have some stuff in the
Yeah.
Riverlands, and which leads to the Erie, and then but that then goes back to the North. So to me, I like that this book feels so unique to the other ones, and you really feel that when you get into book 2 and the chapters start to get longer, the world starts to
Yeah.
expand. I really appreciate what book 1 did and what it set up, and I think that I really appreciate how George was able to connect Daenerys's character to the main story, which is something that feels not at all present in the other books, really, outside of maybe book 3 at times. But, in this book, Daenerys is very relevant to the story going on with Robert and Ned and their discussions about what they should do about her and how that leads to turmoil between the two. I like that even though Daenerys is very isolated from the story, of course, she still seems to have a reason as to why she's there and has some influences. And that's something I have a big criticism of Daenerys of, is that she feels so disconnected from the rest of the story that she feels like she's on her own side story that should have just been like a novella, like the Duncan Egg stuff.
Hmm.
So yeah, I enjoy book 1. I think the only reason I have it lower is just preference. I think of these first three
Hmm.
or the first 3 books of the series, it's all preference to me. To me, I you could rearrange these in any order, and I could see exactly why. Just to me, the Game of Thrones as the starting book is down here at 3.
Yeah. I'll go more in detail here whenever we get to Game of Thrones. But I will say that when it comes to the what you were talking about earlier about how the world really starts to expand once we get past the first book, I think that's something that I've grown to appreciate about the first book. Like I love the expansion of the lore. However, some of the later books, you definitely feel like you're playing hot potato between, it's like, all right, we're following Tyrion. Okay, now we're following
Yeah.
Dany, we're following John, and it's just all over the place. Whereas with this first book specifically, A Game of Thrones, what makes it unique and different from the other books is that 60% of the story is following Ned Stark and characters around Ned
Yes.
Stark. It's very much focused on that, on him trying to investigate the murder mystery of John Arryn in King's Landing, and him receiving the summons from King Robert asking him to be his hand of the king. All that stuff is very much focused, it's concentrated, and it very much feels like it's more so following Ned and his adventures than it is following everybody,
Yeah.
just again playing hot potato with everybody.
Everything feels connected in the book. Outside of, I'd say
Yes.
John, almost John is the only one where I'm like, he does kind of feel like he's kind of off by himself, especially after Tyrion leaves, but there is still that connection there. Things that are happening in King's Landing affect how John's character moves on and how he takes certain actions, almost deserting at one point in the book. So
Yeah.
I just think that the story feels connected. Catelyn's POVs have a massive influence on Ned's POVs, and Ned's POVs have a massive implication on what's happening with Bran at Winterfell and the Robb, plot line. And so I agree. I think that's a really big point of book 1. So
Yeah.
let's move then to number 2, JC. What is your number 2?
Well, we were just talking about it. A Game of Thrones is my number two. In addition to all the stuff we just talked about, I really appreciate how focused of a narrative it is. It definitely keys us in on what is the predominant driving force of this story, which is, this war that's brewing between the War of the Five Kings. But in addition to that, you also have, and I know both you and I have, kind of our trepidation about Jon Snow and some of his chapters up in the north. However, it is key in getting us to understand the real threat
Yep.
that lies north of the wall, which is the overall message of the story. While everyone is kind of having these petty power squabbles about, no, I'm the king, no, I'm the king, we've got this very real threat of the others that's going to consume everybody, and everybody needs to come together to work on that. But obviously, everybody's too distracted with their, wanting to be king. So it's a very focused narrative. I also just subjectively, I love the character of Ned Stark. Yeah, he's, your stereotypical fantasy protagonist, but sue me, okay? I love good guys. I love good guys trying to do good guy things. It's what I like. And Ned Stark is the prime example of that. It gets him killed, but I fell in love with the character. So Ned Stark, a more concise narrative, everything feeling connected, everything feeling necessary to the overall story. Even though I complain about Dany, and again, she's not my favorite perspective, she has a pivotal part to play. She's the person who's going to come to Westeros at some point and reclaim her rightful place as the Targaryen queen, the OG Targaryen family that was once there. Everything feels like it's necessary for the overall story, and I love it. It's just it's a good introduction to this wonderful world that George has created.
I mean, I'll go even a step further. You were talking about Ned. I mean, yes, he's already such an interesting character, but the way George throws a character into this environment that is totally foreign to Ned, putting him in this
Yeah.
political, corrupt area in King's Landing, it just reads so interesting because you're just going through this whole time and you're thinking about how is Ned gonna, deal with this stuff and how is he gonna deal with when Robert dies and all that stuff, which has led a lot of people to think Ned is stupid. Ned is not stupid. He has morals and he
No.
follows them. That's all I'm gonna say. But yeah, people give Ned a lot of hate. I feel like, and Ned is a character that he had all the power until Robert died. When Robert died, then he made some mess ups. But yeah, that's a whole nother video. But I guess I'll get into my number two. So my number two is what I think is most people's number one. I feel like I've done polls in the past just based on my own community, other people's rankings. Number two for me is A Storm of Swords. I
Hmm.
love A Storm of Swords. It's basically this. You start the book and it just keeps going up the whole time. It doesn't come down.
Oh yeah.
There's no pauses, there's no breaks. You just keep going. And it just builds and it builds and it builds. You just have the red wedding, you have the purple wedding, you've got Tywin's death, Tyrion's trial, Oberyn in the mountain. I mean, it's just a book that just keeps going. It's payoff after payoff after payoff. It is the finish of really the first three books. Everything is built to this moment. Every little tiny detail of Tyrion that's been going through book two and people he's maybe slighted in that book, or his issues with his father that was foreshadowed in book one. Everything just comes to a head in this book, and this is a book of payoffs. It is supposed to be a crowd pleaser book. It just is. That's what it is. And again, I think it's just preference. Of these first three, I really can't tell you why I like one book over the other. It really just comes down to I prefer to read something compared to something else. And I think the only thing I can maybe look at is I think book three at times has pacing issues in terms of just you're just going up the whole time. There isn't a lot of time to reflect on what you're reading. Because once
Hmm.
the red wedding happens, okay, well, only a couple of chapters later, we're going to see,
Oh
Joffrey's
yeah.
dead. So it's like you don't even really have all that much time to reflect on the things that happen, which is what I think makes Feast for Crows. I appreciate it more because it is that reflection point. It is that point where all this stuff just happened in Storm of Swords. How does that impact our characters? How do our characters reflect on the events of the Red Wedding now? And the Red Wedding is still a force that's driving in even into book five and will be a big part of book six. And I just think that this book handles all those payoffs really well. I think I just prefer another book to it. But JC, you want to make any comments before we get to your number one, which is obviously going to be this book. So I guess let's just segue into your number one so you can talk about it.
So yes, predictably, the basic man's pick, or whatever you want to call it. Yes, my number one pick is a Storm of Swords, just like 90% of people have on their rankings
Yep.
list. But you know what? I think, in my opinion, there's a reason why, with exception of Greece, it's on most people's number one on their list. And that's honestly, yeah, it's a crowd pleasing book. It's the climax to all the stories that have been built up over the previous two books. We've got, obviously the Red Wedding, the Purple Wedding, Mountain versus the Viper. The battle at the wall with the wildlings, all the stuff that's going on there with Sam trying to escape the others, him coming in contact with Cold Hands, Stannis Baratheon saving Jon Snow from the wildlings. Obviously, the super ending there with Littlefinger, it being revealed that Littlefinger was behind this whole entire story from the very beginning. He's the puppet master driving everything. He was the one who ordered Lysa Arryn to kill John Arryn and, start this whole War of the Five Kings. And then the reveal of Lady Stoneheart, still being resurrected from a people who we thought was dead from Catelyn Stark. There's so much here that makes for an action-packed
Yep.
narrative that I think just sticks with me, despite the fact that I know probably the first two books probably had more in terms of character because we got to spend a little bit more time with them and it wasn't as rushed as, well, not rushed necessarily, but it wasn't as frenetic as book three feels. I just love the freneticism. I love the nonstop action, as basic as that sounds. It's a very wonderful conclusion to this act one of this A Song of Ice and Fire series. And that's what makes me excited for The Winds of Winter, which is promised to be the conclusion of the Act Two storylines with A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. I love how everything kind of came together. The only thing that I will say that I think kind of docks A Storm of Sword, and this might be just me being nitpicky, was the reveal of Joffrey Baratheon being the person who sent the Catspaw dagger after Bran Stark in book one. I think that's the only thing where I kind of was like, this kind of whiffed for me. I wasn't quite, the reveal was kind of, I don't know, kind of a little bit of a letdown. Also, it didn't really make a lot of sense. I was like, well, wouldn't it make more sense if it was Littlefinger? I think there'd be potential there. But that aside, there's so much here that I think that makes for a great narrative. And I always look forward to rereading A Storm of Swords. But Greece, what about we already know what's your number one,
Well,
but
I'm
what
going
do
to
you think,
talk on
Chris?
Storm of Swords for a second because I think you brought up an interesting
Okay.
point. One thing I'll say about the Joffrey kind of reveal about book one, I will say it's kind of thrown in at a very weird point, which I don't think helps it. Like it gets thrown
Yeah.
in, a lot of that plot kind of happens, during this point where we're building up to the Purple Wedding, and it's like it just feels almost like okay, we got all this stuff going on, and then this is just going on through Tyrion's head besides that information, and it's like that's one of the things I talk about with Storm Swords is just there's a lot of payoffs getting thrown at you, and you got to keep up. Which again, I want to point out when I was saying that for my number two, that's me trying to find any reason that I think I have a Clash of Kings higher than it, because I think when I first read the books, the Storm of Swords was my number one. Like if I had just read the books once, I think Storm of Swords originally was my favorite.
Mhm.
But yeah, I agree with you. I completely, and I think that anyone that has it at number one, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I think for me, it is just a personal favoritism and or bias that it's the same idea with Fire and Blood. It's the same idea. So for my number one, I have a Clash of Kings. It's the book I'm currently rereading right now, and I love so many things that are happening in this book more than its obvious flaws. I think its obvious flaws are Daenerys is just bad in this book. Outside of House of the Undying, she's not good. Her first chapter is basically like a catch up. It's like, oh yeah, this is what happened in book one. They wander around. Okay. And then all of her chapters in Karth are just, in my opinion, outside of the House of the Undying stuff, is just not interesting. I don't enjoy it really.
Yeah.
I don't think it's doing all that much for the character of Daenerys. Whereas book one, like, did I think a ton for her character. I really enjoyed her. She goes from being my favorite POV with Ned of book one to my least favorite of book two. So it's not that I hate Daenerys. It's just I find her quality is just not very good in the book. But I think that for me, I enjoy Stannis' story so much in this book. I enjoy the prologue with Crescent, even though it's really long. I really enjoy the background of the character. I love the setting that we're in with the War of the Five Kings. It's my favorite, setting because we have so many interesting things going on with how are we going to navigate this war? Tywin and the Lannisters, the bulk majority of their forces dealing with Robb. How is Robb going to navigate that? Some of the internal conflicts that are going on with Catelyn, and she's always put in the most interesting settings between Renly and Stannis. And those two have, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating conflicts, as they're just direct opposite characters. That is all great. Even Catelyn by the end of it, where she thinks she's basically lost almost all of her children at this point, and that leads her to do some things
Yeah.
that aren't great. I just find her to be so interesting to read, even though I don't love Catelyn as a person. I find her to be so interesting to read. And then Tyrion, I feel like I say this every time I have a reread chapter for the character, is that there's just some big moment, or there's just some really enjoyable moment in every single chapter. And I think that his POV in this book is probably one of the best of the series. If you just look at one individual POV for a book,
Right.
um, I don't know. I just really love a lot of the plot lines that happen in this book more than the other books, and they just stick with me more. That's all I can really say about it. I don't know how else to explain it outside of Stannis is my favorite character. This is really his big book, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So yeah, JC, you have any comments on A Clash of Kings being my my favorite?
I mean, they're the same as yours. I mean, throughout the first book, we got so many mentions about Stannis Baratheon, and then to finally see the one true king kind of take up. Oh wait, actually he doesn't take up that much page time, but
Yeah,
people in book like he dominates so much of book two. You know, people talk about him, and then when we turn to him, it's like, oh, for good reason, because he's like a stern man who's going to get things done, and he's got this shadowy witch behind him that's also helping him get things done. It's like, ooh, better not mess with this guy. And then also Tyrion Lannister, I think he has 15 point of view chapters in this book.
it's
Yeah,
around
he
there.
has
Yeah,
a
he has a
lot.
lot. He dominates the book. Him and Arya dominate
Yeah,
this book.
yeah, but for good
Yeah,
reason. I mean, Tyrion is, trying to prepare for this upcoming battle of the Blackwater Bay. That's the fantastic climax for this book. He's preparing everything in the background. And then while he's doing this, he's also manipulating these three schlubs, Grand Maester Pycelle, Littlefinger, and Varys into kind of doing his bidding. And it's so great to see kind of Tyrion in action, kind of you know having a lot of agency within this book and just getting stuff done. And he's hilarious. It helps
yeah.
that he's hilarious too. So yeah, I totally get why this would be your favorite book.
I another thing I just want to say about this book that I really enjoy is I enjoy that George is able to make, because this really is the journey book. It's the middle book. It's the book that's supposed to
Hmm.
connect all the events of book one, how we started this, and then get us to A Storm of Swords to get all these wonderful payoffs. None of those payoffs are that great if book two is bad. So again, people that don't like book two, if you like book three, I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, I just find that I enjoy the time that was spent on this book. That there's such subtle foreshadowing through a lot of the different chapters. And I will say Ari, I didn't mention her, and she's a dominant POV of the book. I enjoy her as being our first introduction into what George is really going to talk about a lot, especially in book three and the later books, of being this. How are the people affected? How are the small people or small folk affected? How this war is terrorizing the Riverlands and destroying people's lives, and the horrors that Arya, sees, hearing people screaming in the middle of nights, towns abandoned, people being buried on the side of the road. I really enjoy that aspect of Arya as well, and her Harrenhal stuff. It's just fantastic. I love her Harrenhal stuff. It's really our first real indication of what Harrenhal could be like, which is something that the TV show kind of ran with in House of the Dragon. But yeah, so those are our two rankings. JC, anything else you want to
Yeah.
comment on this? I'll have our rankings up on screen so you guys can compare them to your own. Write those down in the comments. But yeah,
Yeah, this series is pretty great. Even though I'm sure people will take issue with some of our picks,
yes,
I think at the end of the day, we love these books. These are some fantastic books, and it's what makes us crazy for the Winds of Winter. Even 14 years after the release of A Dance with Dragons, we've dug into these books so much. We're excited for follow up. Hopefully, we get it. I don't know when. Hopefully, soon. I don't know,
we hope.
but we hope. But yeah, this is such a great series. And as someone who has read other fantasy series out there, because there's a lot of other great fantasy works out there, George R. R. Martin is just on another level.
Yep.
It's night and day. It's like, man, it's like, yeah, there's other books out there. Yeah, Sanderson's got another book, but it's just not the same. I really want Winds of Winter. George, what are you doing to us, man?
They should just change Euron's catchphrase to being, "When we see a Nada blog, we pray." Also,
Perfect.
also for book four and book five lovers, don't hate us too much. I know we ranked your
Yeah.
books low, but hey,
It's
everybody has a
it's like
preference.
pizza, man.
Yeah.
It's like pizza. Like you can't have. I mean, you can have bad pizza, but I mean, as long as you put the ingredients and put it in the right temperature, it's still good pizza. Like just different flavors of pizza. They're all still good. It's delicious.
See, you might prefer pineapple on your pizza, and I might call you a heretic, but we can all have our own ideas. That's what the beauty of it. But yeah. So thank you, JC, for coming on the channel. Everybody check him out because he has done a review, I believe, of all the books. You've done all the books, right?
Yes, I've done a review of all the books. I've also summarized all the books. I'll have a summary of A Dance of Dragons out here very soon. Took me a long time to
I
make, but
can
I hope
imagine.
people enjoy it. And yeah, and it's just series is so much fun. We'll hopefully get to delve into, I don't know, another new book or another new novella
We
from
keep
George
praying.
soon. I don't know.
But yes, check out JC or the Advocates channel. The link will be at the top in the description. And we will see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.
Thank- Thanks. Bye.